All right, hello and welcome everyone to the June 2021 Microsoft Teams and O365 Power Users, Power User Group. Today we're going to be talking about Azure or Azure, depending on, I don't know if there's the right way to pronounce that, Active Directory. There's some nuances about Azure Active Directory that are actually very different from what we're all, well, if you're a power user, if you've ever worked with Active Directory that's based on a server, it's different. And so that's actually one of the things that we've been seeing. And one of the reasons why we wanted to host this session is to get folks thinking about, because we get a lot of requests from clients now, especially after the pandemic or now that we're coming out of the pandemic, is do I need this file server anymore? Do I need this server that's sitting in my office? I've already moved my applications to SaaS maybe or to some sort of cloud hosted environment, but what do I need to do here? So that does pose some challenges of going serverless. But we're going to talk about some of those things today. Gerald's going to lead us through that. By the way, I'm Nate Austin. I'll be doing some facilitation. Gerald's going to be presenting, and Stephanie's going to be producing behind the scenes. So we're trying to mute folks as they come in, but please go ahead and mute yourself if you think about it. Please go ahead and use the chat function, and as we'll open it up, Gerald's going to go through some content, go through some demonstration, and then we're going to open up for questions towards the end. And go ahead and use your raise hand features to go through that, or you can throw questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll either try to answer them via chat as we go, or we will open those up and ask questions there at the end. So as anything comes up throughout the session, go ahead and throw those questions in there. And we'll do our best to either again answer them at the time or go over them later. So one thing before we get going, I always like to say just a little bit about MyTech. We are a small and medium business technology and business consulting organization. We've been in business a little over 20 years. Our goal is to help our clients implement a proven IT strategy. Doesn't mean it's the only IT strategy. It's just the one that we found that works really well and allows us to deliver consistent and reliable results for our clients. Ultimately, we hope that it removes IT challenges for you so that you can focus on serving your customers better and ultimately be more adaptable to the other business challenges that we all face, such as a pandemic. And working remote or a serverless future, those kind of things. So partnering with our clients and making sure that we do strong collaboration, our clients can achieve 4 times more value and productivity from their IT investments. So if that sounds great for you and you want to have a conversation, please raise your hand. We'd love to have a chat. Otherwise, I know that's not why you're here today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Gerald, who will guide us through Azure Active Directory and what you might need for a serverless future. Gerald, take it away.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Nate. So yeah, let's I guess let's start off with what we'd like to define as, hey, we're expecting you all to be power users. And so what is a power user ultimately? We don't look at a power user as somebody who's actually behind the scenes doing all the administration actions and doing all the fun stuff that some of us geeks like to call fun. But we're looking for the people that are actually driving the adoption, that understands the pros and cons of a lot of the technologies we do. There's decisions that as the nerd in the operation in the background, we're performing certain things, but we don't always understand what the ramifications is going to be on the organization or why that organization needs those kinds of settings. So we're looking for people like you to help us make sure that we're actually doing what you need in your organization. So really, you're kind of the lead in the organization to help make sure that you're making the right IT decisions, that you're moving forward, and you're actually helping your organization in the best process for what we're trying to do. So previous sessions, if you've been through several of our sessions before, you know that we've talked about storage of files and SharePoint. We know that how 365 stores those files, how Teams interacts with all those files. We know that M365 groups are integral to some of that security stuff. We know how to bring guests in to collaborate. We've talked about SharePoint websites. We've talked about SharePoint lists. We've talked a lot about the operational side, kind of in the productivity suites. Now we're going to start getting more into some of the hardcore background of how everything is set up, and also how to start moving forward for those serverless environments and how that actually really impacts what we're trying to do. So start off with, and this is going to become a further down in our conversation, this is going to become a big deal, but I like to point out what the kind of the suite of tools looks like out there. There's actually kind of three tiers or two primary tiers of applications or kind of categories of applications within the stack of things. You have the Office 365, which is or better known as O365, which is primarily focused around the productivity suite of things. Then there's also the M365 or Microsoft 365, which is their new full stack of features and security tools. And then there's also the business side of things, which is kind of split into two sides of this, the basic and standard, which are kind of tied to the O365 side of things, and the business premium, which is tied to the M365 side of things. So we'll get into this deeper, but I really do want to point out that a lot of these features do exist, and the things that we're going to be talking about today actually do fit into the Microsoft 365 and the Business Premium, but are actually not included in the O365. So that's kind of a key licensing difference, but there are ways to add them to your infrastructure if you are on the Office 365 suite. So what we're going to be talking about today is actually IAM, or Identity and Access Management. Active Directory is one of those ways of doing this. There are a lot of different ways. Every system that you sign into has an IAM. It's how the authentication works. So even if you're signing into your Facebook or your Google account, doesn't really make any difference. You're signing into an IAM system. The big points behind what an IAM is you have a centralized management of objects. You have a listing of all the users, a listing of all the computers and servers and everything that's all interfaced together. And that's what drives the authentication for those systems. So we get a lot of authentication points that come through this. We get a lot of, all your logins all happen through this. And this is kind of the key component. In those large scale systems, the more uptime you need to have that system be very distributed, and you need to have high availability behind that. So how do you make sure that, if you're Facebook, you obviously can't have one server processing all your logins. How do you get a system that does? And the way you do that is by distributing those systems all over the world and making sure that there's redundancy and a lot of high availability built into that. What we're probably used to is a system called Active Directory, or AD. This was a system that was developed by Microsoft. It was introduced in Windows Server 2000, so 21 years ago at this point. It was a big deal. It really changed the way that we looked at things, and it was no longer just kind of a flat structure of users and computers. It started introducing all sorts of additional ways of managing systems and kind of combining things together. And we had catalogs of systems that actually, dealt with authentication for users, for computers, for the servers that you have. All of that kind of stuff was all served out through these catalogs. But the problem is that was great for your local on-premise systems. If you wanted to make that really highly available, you wanted to make that really, really scaled up. If you were a large organization, it took a lot of work to build those systems. You had to have lots of servers, and you had to have them spread out across locations so that you could have that redundancy built into your systems. That, today, the cloud is making some of that easier, but you still have to worry about some of that kind of stuff. If these systems are down, it can severely impact the operations of your business. So that's fine, but that's not it, right? We don't have just our local servers anymore. We all know that there's all of these apps that we have. We have all these cloud apps. We have 365. We have all these things all over the place. We have devices that are never on premise anymore. We have servers spread all over between our on premise and in the cloud and all sorts of things. We've got private cloud. We've got public cloud. Like the typical user, I was reading a report the other day, the typical business user has like 55 passwords that they have to remember for different systems. That's a problem for us, right? We don't want to have those kinds of things going on. We don't want to have to remember 55 accounts. That's also 55 separate systems, 55 separate IAMs that have to keep track of all that information. And how do you keep it synchronized, and how do you keep it secure? And this has really become the problem, right? We're sitting in a very bad spot. So where does this put us? Well, Microsoft has developed something called Azure Active Directory, AAD, as we will refer to it in the rest of this presentation to speed things up. So Azure Active Directory really is It's a core component of Azure. It was one of the first components that was delivered. And for those of you not aware what Azure is Azure is actually Microsoft's global cloud platform. So it is all of O365, all of the 365 applications run inside Azure. Much of the Xbox environment runs inside Azure. You can buy Azure resources. There is a lot of stuff that runs inside Azure, and Azure is just kind of the key term and for the business division of Microsoft that runs all of their cloud services. It's massive. It is worldwide. It is everywhere. There are data centers. I think that it's on 6 of the 7 continents. It's and they're working on trying to get one on the 7th. Like it's pretty much everywhere at this point. They even had one. They just pulled it up recently, but they even had one. Floating in the bottom of the ocean. So they've been trying to put stuff everywhere. They've been really testing things. And so they've got this truly massive and worldwide scale capable of doing these things. They designed this for 5 nines of uptime, so 99.999% uptime. And one of the key design factors is also what they call a zero RTO or RPO. For those of you not aware, RTO and RPO kind of come from the backup terms, return to operation and recovery point objective. So how long does it take to come back up, and how much data are you going to lose? And Microsoft says we don't want to ever lose data, and we want to be up instantaneously. So that RTO, RPO of 0 is a huge deal. And they've actually been able to meet most of these specs for the most part for a long time now. There are tiers, like any Microsoft product. There are multiple products that you can buy. There's a free package that comes out. Most of you are probably very much aware of this from the Microsoft 365 apps package, which comes included with any of the 365 platforms. And then there's some add-on plans, Plan 1 and Plan 2, that add additional features that we'll be going through today. So the benefit of doing Azure Active Directory is it's one connection. We can build this one environment and have it connect to all those other cloud systems. We can have this one single sign-on interface, as we call it, actually deal with Azure. It can deal with Office 365. It can deal with Box.com. It can deal with Dropbox. If you have all the licensing to tie all these systems together, this will interface with all of those platforms. But that's fine. You might still have that existing Active Directory, though, on-premise. How do you deal with that? Well, we use a service called Azure Active Directory Connect. This now allows us to synchronize those objects on your local Active Directory, put them up inside Azure Active Directory. There's a couple catch-22s. One of those is the Active Directory locally on your system is always the primary system. So those are going to be your master authorities. So sometimes you have to make changes on that local Active Directory before you can push those settings up into the cloud. Some changes can only be made in Active Directory because that is your master authority. That means that if you want to change email addresses or set certain security settings or add people to certain groups, that all has to be done on the local Active Directory and then synchronized back up. But some of the cool things that it does do is it sends password hashes up to the Azure Active Directory. It doesn't actually send your password up there. It sends a specially modified version of it that is replicatable so that they can determine whether or not you are using the same password up into Azure. So they don't store your actual password, they store a hash of it. But they do synchronize that information back and forth, which then allows you to have the same password on premise in your local Active Directory as you do up in the Azure Active Directory. Of course, with everything else, like we were talking about earlier, we add those Plan 1 or Plan 2 licenses, and we get all sorts of other features. And some of those key ones are the ability to be able to receive writes back from the Azure Active Directory to the local AD. So the ability to change our passwords, for example, up inside Azure Active Directory and have that show up inside Active Directory. So I can sign into my O365 cloud account from home, change my password, and when I come to work the next day, my password will be the same as what I expected on my local computer. You can also do some device synchronization and some group synchronization back and forth by doing this too. But the big one is the password sync that actually happens out of Azure Active Directory. So now that we've combined this together, we can see that we have We have this line basically from our on-premise that we can have to Azure Active Directory, which creates this connection. So now my PC that's sitting in my office with all my legacy servers and my legacy environments can still continue to work. And that synchronizes up to the Azure Active Directory, which now handles all my cloud authentications. That is the same authentication, the same usernames, the same passwords in both systems. So now I truly have very much a single sign-on. If we are going to be building these kinds of things, this does still require that on-premise or in-cloud or managed server to be part of the scenario, but that doesn't mean that we have to have those things. Ultimately, we can operate Azure Active Directory standalone. That can just be by itself. Earlier, I used the idea of having Facebook as an IAM device. Ultimately, Facebook could be running on Azure Active Directory. It does not, but it could be. And if it did, that would be the centralized authentication, and it wouldn't have that old legacy Active Directory. It would just be purely running off of that. And for things like that, if you were to develop some of those kinds of things, you would be using the Azure Active Directory free features. So you get some security with this, you get some certain controls, but as you move up into this, you get into the Microsoft 365 apps. When you activate the Microsoft 365 apps against Azure Active Directory, you get a few more features, you get a few more security controls, and when you add those P1 licenses, you get even more. So you can really start getting some really neat features especially when it comes to security around this. And two of them that we'll be covering up today are going to be things like fraud alert and conditional access policies. These are some really big deals for the technologies that you get with the Azure AD Premium P1 and P2. We also have computers, right? We have computers at our local workstations. How do we get that information up into Azure AD? How does this change? In our old legacy type environments, we joined our computers to our Active Directory. But if we don't have Active Directory anymore, if we're doing purely cloud, how does this work? Well, there is a way to actually join a PC to Azure Active Directory. To really make any benefit out of that, though, you really do need to have those. You need to have a P1 or higher license. But when you do this kind of join, we can actually authenticate the PC right against Azure. So that gives us the ability to log into our computer using our Azure Active Directory accounts. But more importantly, it gives the ability for another administrator to be able to sign in, or another user to sign into that computer using their creds without having to go through and create a local user account and all sorts of things like that. There's also the ability to do registration or hybrid join. This is kind of a two-phased approach to authentication. What ends up happening is you build an authentication against the Azure Active Directory system and against the local Active Directory. So you'd sign into your PC using your traditional authentication to the local Active Directory. And then from there, it would authenticate you into the Azure Active Directory to get access to those cloud controls. We're going to do a demo a little bit later where we can actually show you what the difference between these two are. But really, it's kind of just minor differences. One provides a better user interaction, though. By doing that, either that hybrid join or that Azure Active Directory join, you get rid of a lot of the prompts that the users would experience. So one of the other big things that I talked about was security that happens inside this. So when you buy the additional features of the Plan 1 or Plan 2 licenses in Azure Active Directory, you get a lot of additional security features. So the key ones are you get the ability to do a branded sign-on portal. So this gives you the ability to actually have a portal that is unique and looks like your company. The big benefit of that is if somebody were to try to attempt to phish you or try to steal your creds, your users will get used to seeing a certain look and a certain interface, and they aren't going to see a generic interface. And it's going to be really hard for the attackers to know what that interface is going to look like and try to emulate that. So by doing the branding, you're going to see your names, you're going to be able to have your contact information, you're going to be able to have a lot of that kind of stuff associated with the login screens so that you can see, hey, I'm logging into something that's mine. I know it's mine, and I know it's not some mal actor trying to get my credentials. You get the single sign-on features, right? So you get the ability to add additional resources. We'll show you how we use this a little bit later, but we can actually sign into other platforms using single sign-on. I know here at MyTech, almost all of our tools are integrated this way. So we use our same username and password that we log into our PCs with all of our cloud applications, all of our on-premise applications, everything that we do are all utilizing single sign-on. So we have one set of security, one set of authentication points that we have to monitor. We also have one account to disable. If I disable that one account, we lock them out, lock the user out of every system that they have. You get multi-factor authentication. Now, multi-factor authentication does exist in all versions of the Azure AD suite, but we also get conditional access and mobile application management if we go into the if we go up into the P1 and P2 series, or Plan 1 and Plan 2 series. And what that gives us is that gives us an additional layer of multi-factor authentication. We can actually put controls in place to say, why should we do X versus Y? We get self-service password management. Who's ever forgotten their password? I know I have, right? That's an embarrassing day. Come back after vacation and go, oops, I forgot my password. I have to walk over to the IT person and say, yeah, I need you to reset it for me, please. Self-service password management actually gets rid of some of that. That actually gives us the ability to say, ooh, I forgot my password. Go in and then ask for some credentials that I can provide it that prove who I am. Maybe it's a ping to my phone, maybe it's a connection to an email address, or multiples of those that will actually validate that I am who I say I am, that I have access to these other systems, and then allow me to reset my password by myself. And then also notify all the administrators and everything else that somebody has performed a self-service password reset. We also get cool features like passwordless authentication. This is kind of an up and coming technology. This gets rid of that whole issue of having to forget your passwords, but actually using hardware tokens or biometrics to identify who the person is instead of ever having to use passwords. This is using something very simple like a PIN code or something that you maybe know that's short and sweet, but then also using biometrics or physical devices to actually produce that second authentication point and prove you are who you say you are. And probably the biggest one that I love is you get this magical, you buy just a couple licenses of Azure ADP1 and you get this magical 3,500 person security team monitoring your stuff all the time. Yes, Microsoft has over 3,500 people constantly monitoring just the Azure Active Directory security. They're constantly testing their own stuff. They're looking at brute force attacks. They're blocking all these things. They've got a massive amount of people that do nothing but monitor these things. This is part of Microsoft's $3.2 billion personnel pool of security for the Azure environment alone. So MFA, we talked about MFA and we're like, hey, there's two different ways to do this. If we look at purely the version that comes with the O365 productivity suite, or the free versions, you get a feature called security defaults. This is Microsoft's basically recommended security settings. This automatically turns on a whole bunch of security controls like MFA, limited access controls, turning off legacy protocols. So your POP3, your SMTP, your IMAP access, and it forces only modern authentication and some other controls. It is the easy switch, right? It is the easy button. You can just flip that switch. Everything is done. But one of the key catch-22s with that is it's an all or nothing setting. You can't pick and choose what users get this. When you enable it in your environment, everybody gets less than 14 days to activate it. And if they don't, they are locked out from ever signing in again. If you have that copier scanner that's still using SMTP to authenticate up into the servers, you can't use it anymore. It's going to break a bunch of stuff. So how do we get around that? We use something called conditional access. Conditional access basically is a set of rules that we can build that follow a series of policies or structures that we put in place. We have to build those policies, so it's not quite as easy as that flip a switch, but we can put things in that say, this is a risky scenario or this is a not risky scenario, and allow the system to determine what it should follow for all of that. We can control, we can break those policies down by users or by groups, and then those policies ultimately end up controlling access. This is a good example of this would be able to take that same scanner, exclude it from the multi-factor authentication, allow it to use that legacy protocol because it's only coming from this IP address. We can set some of those things in place. It is now a secure login. You know that login is not going to get used by anybody else because it can only sign in from the environment that it's at. Conditional access is a requirement, is one of our recommended ways of doing MFA, but it is also requires the P1 or the Plan 1 or Plan 2 licenses to be added in. That is not part of the base package. So one of the other ways to look at conditional access is, this is one of the things that we're starting to see on a regular basis, is you have companies that have frontline workers. Those are the workers that probably only sign into the office. Maybe they sign into POS terminals or check-in terminals. They're your frontline workers, right? They're the people that just, they come to work, they do the work, they leave. They don't sign into the systems any other time, but they still have to have logins. They still have to have email when they're in the office. And so with that kind of stuff, the company most of the time doesn't want to have to force users to put MFA on their desktops. They don't want to have to do any of those kinds of controls. So they actually do it through, they want them to still log in. We still want the security. We still want all of that. So what we would do in this scenario is we'd actually set up a conditional access policy that says, if you are a frontline worker and you are signing into these computers that are inside the office, allow access without an MFA. But if you aren't, deny access. So if you're trying to sign in from home, deny access. I don't want people signing in from home. You can't get access anymore. Then I can also build another policy for all the rest of the office employees that says, hey, you're signing in from anywhere, from your phone, from home, from the office. You have to authenticate and validate who you are. And you also have to use multi-factor authentication to do that every so often, or whenever your risk changes also. So kind of some building upon this that actually allows those conditional access to really help us out. So I fed you a lot of information really fast. Now we're going to have some fun. So I'm going to set up a little bit of a demo here quick. If I can find my mouse again. Stop sharing this screen
And hey, Gerald, while you're doing that, there was a
yes.
question that came in, and I think you touched on it. And I know that we said we'll save questions to the end, but I think it might make sense to touch on it as far as with Azure Active Directory, would you still need at least one server on-prem for Active Directory? And I know the answer to that is no, but there are some nuances there. So, and I think you touched on it a bit, but
Yep.
maybe as you're transitioning, a good thing to maybe speak to a little bit more.
Yeah, so Azure Active Directory by itself does not require that user still, or doesn't require that local server. But there are some edges with that. We'll get into those here in just a little bit. But yeah, theoretically you can run, I shouldn't even say theoretically. In practicality, you can run Azure Active Directory all by itself. And it can even run in a semi-active state where you can actually have, like in my lab right now that we're going to see, we can actually have Active Directory only connected every so often and not actually be pushing anything that back into that local Active Directory. But I use that Active Directory for being able to run other systems. So I've got a couple of PCs here, and one of these is just a local sign-in. So this would be the same as what you would have at home. This would be like if you had signed into your computer at home or you're doing something like that and you want to be able to access your environment. So I'm going to sign into this one. And I'm going to put this big splash on the back of it. This is danger, right? Because I want you to understand that this is your home computer. This is the computer that is at risk. This is the one that you maybe don't have your corporate policies against. You don't have all of that kind of stuff. But I do want somebody to be able to sign in to check their email or look at some information that they might have inside the organization. When I do this, it is going to ask me for my login information, and it's going to ask me for my password. I want to point this out because I'm actually having to log into this. The system does not know about this computer. This computer does not know about Azure Active Directory. So the only way that Azure Active Directory knows that I'm signing in is purely by signing into this application. You can see that I can pull up my Office portal. This gives me access to things like my Outlook messages. I can read my Outlook. I can see what I've got. I can, I can read my email. Just being super fast today. I can read my email. I can do all of those kinds of things. But maybe I want to say, hey, I want to get into my SharePoint. And from here, I want to be able to access SharePoint and pull up those files that I was working on at the office the other day. The problem is SharePoint's also a risky area. I don't necessarily want somebody to be able to access SharePoint at home unless I know exactly who they are. This is a key source of our company's information. So in this scenario, I actually use conditional access to say, if you're not coming from a trusted environment, force the use of MFA. So I need to find my phone here quick so I can get my code.
And Gerald, this code, I imagine, is just coming from, if folks that aren't familiar with this, it's just an MFA authenticator app that's on your phone that's configured for the user to be able to use, and they just have to pull that up.
Correct. And this can even be, if you've seen other systems, this can also be what they call a push notification. So it can actually be one of those features where it actually pushes the communication to you, or it pushes a notice and saying, hey, can you accept this notice? That is also an option with this. Because of my lab environment, the way we have it set up, I don't use that. But we can use those codes versus or pushes versus codes. You can also use hardware sometimes. So you can actually use a physical token of some kind, whether that be RFID or an actual USB plug that you plug in, to actually issue those same commands. So you can see here now I've gained access to SharePoint. I have access to all this stuff. But I also have one other application that we have added to our single sign-on in this lab, and that's our Oracle Cloud. So Oracle Cloud, maybe we have, maybe we're using some Oracle applications. I want to be able to sign into that Oracle Cloud using my same credentials. So I'm going to say I'm going to sign into my Oracle Cloud. It's going to go and talk to Oracle right now, and it's going to allow me to start signing in. But I'm at home now. Remember, I'm at home. I'm using my non-business computer. I'm going to say I want to authenticate using my Azure AD login to our Oracle infrastructure. And when I do this, Azure AD is actually going to come back and say, sorry, you can't do this. We have additional conditional access controls that say, don't allow access to the Oracle Cloud unless you're coming from a corporate-owned device. So by saying that this corporate-owned machine is the one that can access the Oracle Cloud, this now blocks me because I'm not on a corporate-owned device. So let's actually go to a corporate-owned device. So this computer here is my corporate device. This is a computer that has been joined to the Azure Active Directory. Technical glitches.
Demo fun.
Exactly.
This computer here. Yeah, it's always great when you're running multiple virtual machines and trying to swap between them. So if you've never tried to do that, it definitely poses its own challenges and interesting nuances in a demo lab environment. So
I'm going to fire that up or restart that computer here quick and fire up my virtual phone here too while we're at it. So
and it's always funny that age-old, like, when in doubt, reboot. So even in the virtual world, rebooting helps solve a problem. So yeah, thanks, Gerald. Sorry to kill some time there for you.
Yeah, no problem. What I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to I'm gonna go back into my home computer here, and I'm actually gonna do another quick demo. So I close my browser. I'm actually gonna make sure that I'm logged out of everything here and sign back into my applications. But I'm gonna actually sign in as a different user. So I need to sign in as. So when I sign in as this user, so two things I want to point out. First of all, you notice how the background changes as soon as I identify myself. This is my custom branding. You can see that this is branding my domain. I've thrown a login screen in there. You can see that I've got the background information that's, it's changing the background. It's showing that I'm working in my lab and I'm not working in another tenant. I'm not entering my creds into a forged environment or anything else like that. So one of the things that I want to show is I have this forgot my password. Oh,
well, Gerald, yeah, sorry. There's just and I know you mentioned this earlier, but this branding isn't just like, hey, cool, to show my company's like logo or background. It's to help prevent against phishing, so that you can coach and teach and train your team and your end users to know that if you don't see this background, you are not at the right place. Do not enter your credentials, because it could be someone trying to phish you. So the part of the value isn't just the brand, because this is the only people that are going to see this are your team. So like branding isn't for them, for like just for branding purposes, because it's not like your public website. This is to help prevent against phishing, so your team can say, wait a second, something's wrong here, because it's not showing me the information I should be seeing before I enter my password.
Correct. So here I'm going to say we have this thing that's now in front of me, right? Oh man, I forgot what this password is. I can't remember how to log in. So I have this forgot my password link. I'm actually going to go into this and I'm going to say, okay, hey, it's giving me the opportunity now to reset who I am. I have pre-set up a lot of this information. So back when I did remember my password, I gave it some personal questions. I gave it my personal email address. I've given it my cell phone number. I've given it all sorts of things so that I can go in and see what all I've got. So it's going to ask me, hey, enter your username here and, prove that I'm not a robot. So we'll see how close I can get here. What this is going to do is in the background, it's going to go query and it's going to say, hey, step one, you need to prove that you have access to this information. Do you have an email address that kind of looks like this? Or do you want me to send you a text? Or do you want me to call you? We can choose these different items. And I can, in this scenario, it's going to actually force me to put 2 of these in. So I could say, enter a code from my Authenticator app. And amazingly enough, see if this one's going to work for me too. It's not. So we'll actually send an email here. And you notice that this alternate email is not my work email because I don't have access to my work email. That's doing that. I'm going to restart this. My virtual phone's a little bit picky. And I'm going to sign into my email account here. And it's saying, hey, it sent me an email now that says, here's your code, go validate yourself. It even also tags my branding that I have. So now I can even tell that these emails are legitimate, coming to me from what I expect. And now I can enter in my validation code here. So there's my first set. Now I'm going to say, hey, text my mobile phone. Or I can say, call it, or I can enter in an authenticator code. So I'm going to go back to my computer here, or my phone. I'm going to log in here. Yes, that is not my actual PIN. And I've got my Microsoft Authenticator app.
And Gerald, as you're doing some of this stuff, you can actually apply, I know that you're probably going to talk about the mobile application management. You can apply some security requirements there too, typically around requiring lock screens, requiring certain information in order to even access this stuff in the first place.
Correct. So wanted to make sure I got through this in the period of time that I had. So yes, that is very correct, Nate. So much with those conditional access rules, like we were talking about being able to say who can sign in from where and when. One of the other things that we can also apply is what's called a mobile application management platform. So this is different than MDM. This is MAM. MDM is mobile device management. We're actually looking at managing the applications. A key reason why we want to do this is what we call data containerization. We want to break that data up. We want to store the data with applications that we know and trust. For example, I only want people to be able to access their corporate email using the Outlook app on their iPhone or Android device. I can set policies that say, don't allow anything else except for the Outlook app to access the data. I can also say, maybe I want to use SharePoint, and instead of allowing them to use the Chrome browser or their Safari browser on their phones, you have to use the SharePoint app. We can set those same policies in play and limit how those can be accessed. It's much to the same rules that we just wrote for blocking access on the computer. So yeah, it's kind of the same thing, but it's a little different than the device management. One of the tricks with the device management is you're setting rules for how the computer works. We don't want to set rules for how the device works. We don't want to control that device ultimately, unless we do own that as a corporate device. People signing or accessing phones, they're using it on their personal phones. We don't want to wipe their phone. We don't want to wipe all their photos. We don't want to do all that kind of stuff that happens if we use MDM. We only want to protect the sensitive data that our company has. So you can see here that I was able to reset my password. I reset it back to something I have based upon 2 pieces of information or 2 other systems that I had access to. I am now able to set my password. That even wrote it back to my on-premise Active Directory. So now if I were to go back to my computer, I could sign in using this username. So let's go. Hopefully this computer came back. Yay, it works. So this computer, to remind everybody, is my Azure Active Directory joined computer. And you can see that the login is a little bit different. I can either get my picture or I get this little credential that shows that I'm signing in as a work or school account. And this is going to actually identify things, but you'll notice that it also says PIN. It doesn't say password. That's because I've already logged into the system and set up my username. And it's now saying, hey, I know who you are. You're a trusted computer. You don't need to provide all these details anymore. Just give me a simple PIN to log into the system. I can also use biometrics to do this, or I can use my physical device. This is starting the world of that passwordless environment. So I'm just going to type in my password here, or my PIN, and it's going to let me right into my environment. It's going to be the fast environment today.
Right in.
Exactly.
You gotta have some humor with demos. I mean, so
exactly. No matter how many times you try this, it's always fast until it isn't.
yeah.
So now I'm signed in. I signed in with the same credentials that I have signed into this computer into Azure Active Directory. It now knows that I am part of this system. It has authenticated me to the Azure Active Directory. It said, yes, you are the same person who you say you are. Everything is working. You notice that when I launch my browser and I go to Portal, it brings me right in. It lets me in without having to do all those additional factors. It doesn't require passwords. It automatically knows who I am. Everything just automatically integrates. If I were to, for example, start the Mail app, if I had Office installed on here, I could go into Word or Excel or Outlook, but I'm just going to start the local Mail app. And what's going to happen here too is the Mail app is going to recognize that I'm already in the system, and it's going to start grabbing those creds, and it's going to say, hey, I want to add an account. And it should say, give me the option of just choosing my account. So, hey, right there, it automatically identified that I have my 365 account. I can click on this, and it's going to set everything up all automatically with me. I don't have to enter in passwords and go through all sorts of setup rigmarole. It just automatically works. If I go back to my browser here, you can see that I have all my applications. I can sign into my Outlook just as though I was like I was able to before, where it just automatically takes me right into my email. But if I also go back, one of the things that we had locked down saying you had to multi-factor if you were in SharePoint. I'm now on a trusted device. If I go into SharePoint in this scenario, this will say you're on a trusted environment and let me right into SharePoint. Final thing that we broke when we were on the local computer was we couldn't sign into the Oracle Cloud. So if I go to the Oracle Cloud in this scenario, so I'm going to go try to sign into the Oracle Cloud. And when I try to sign into the Oracle Cloud, it's actually going to recognize that I'm on my managed computer now. It's going to say, hey, this is part of our environment. We know all about this. And when I do this, screen, come on.
It's doing a lot of stuff in the background. I mean, basically, it's talking between, let's say, this computer and Azure Active Directory and Oracle and all that, and trying to apply all the policies. So, and plus, you're on the demo, environment. But yes.
Yep. you can see that it let me right into my Oracle because it already said, hey, you've already authenticated against all this stuff. I know who you are. I know who the system is. I know what everything is. I can just let you right in. So I'm right into my Oracle. I can see all my systems. I can see my money. I can see everything that I would expect to be able to see in here. And it just knew that because I was part of the Azure Active Directory and already operating inside that environment. Final piece that I want to show quick is I'm going to sign out here quick. One of the other things that we talked about is that ability, because this is now my authentication point. The computer knows how to authenticate people. It knows how to do all that kind of stuff. I have my user that I just changed my password on my local computer. Maybe I want to sign into this computer now as that user. I can go to other user, and you can see here that it says sign into using your work or school account. I can go here and I can say VDI user 1. And then type in my password. And when I do this, hey, it's recognized me. It even recognized my username. It went out and talked to Azure Active Directory. I didn't have to go create an account on this computer. I didn't have to join it to the domain. I didn't have to be able to access my Active Directory, my old AD server that I've got. This automatically knows how to talk up to the cloud and gain my access. And it's going to act just as though my other lab user was. It's just going to operate the same way. If I pop up the browser, it's going to take me right in. This is showing that I have not signed into this computer before. This is a fresh sign in, the first time this computer has ever seen that login and that password, because I just reset that password a minute ago. So you can see that this actually does operate all that together, and it really allows that single consistency of the same thing that you would experience on a local Active Directory up strictly using the cloud.
Gerald, the other thing that rarely in the IT world, does adding layers of security simplify the experience for the end user. But this is one of those things that it does require more thought and work and policy creation and enforcement, all those kind of things with what Gerald's showing. But in the end, we're actually creating a simpler environment. It's easier for the end user, increases security. They can self-service password reset. They can remember one password instead of 50 plus passwords. So this is one of the things that I know personally, as I'm not as technical as Gerald by any means, but one of the things that I know that has been a frustration for in the technology industry from the end user perspective, and that's why people put passwords on sticky notes still, or put have a password Excel spreadsheet that they keep track of, because they're trying to remember all that. But by working down this path, we can actually make it much easier for end users and increase security. Rarely do those two things go together.
Yeah, no, it's actually quite impressive. One of the neat features that actually comes out with some of the Azure AD Plan 1 and Plan 2 that actually are out there is the ability of, or the sense of understanding things like impossible travel. Because Microsoft is global, they see data all over the world. They have all these systems that are all working everywhere. They can actually see things like, hey, how does you're signing in at one moment in California, the next moment you're trying to sign in from London. Wait a sec, you can't do that in 20 minutes. That's now obviously something that's wrong. Is somebody stolen your creds? One of those is invalid, and we can do things, and we can say these are high risk scenarios. Force things like require MFA, or require a password change, or require validation, or maybe even block sign in until somebody can actually review what's going on. So you can do all sorts of neat things with that kind of stuff, and work through that. So the final stage of this, I'm just going to sign in quick to the Office portal, just to prove that I'm not having to enter in my creds anymore. It's automatically authenticating me. You maybe even saw that when I signed into or launched Edge, it automatically said, "Hey, I'm going to sync. I'm going to tie you into Active Directory. I know how to talk to Azure. I know who you are." It automatically synchronized everything, and you can see that I'm in the environment. This user doesn't have a full Office license. That's why you don't see much here, but it is in the system, and it is actually accessing the environment without any additional logins. So, okay, that's all I've got for the demo. Hopefully that was exciting enough. Let me reshare my slide deck here. We showed you all sorts of cool things, right? This is like, hey, I want to do this now, right? Why isn't everybody doing this? There has to be a catch. Um, this is awesome for workstations. This is great. Like workstations that are anywhere. They can talk to the systems. They can sign into things. But guess what doesn't work very good? Servers. Servers don't work almost at all. In fact, only the latest revisions of Server 2019 are even capable of performing some actions with Azure Active Directory. You can't do centralized login with it. The only thing you can really do is apply permissions to file shares using Azure Active Directory. You really can't do anything else yet. So this is still a major, if you've got localized servers, if you've got some of those infrastructures, this is still not quite there. And that's why we need to have that hybrid approach where we have Azure Active Directory Connect, tying your local Active Directory against the Azure Active Directory. You lose GPOs. Maybe you don't know what those are. Group policy objects. Group policy objects are a way for us to be able to push settings down to computers and be able to access and modify settings on machines from the domain level. So your computer, when it talks to the domain to authenticate you, also grabs policies to set settings, map drives, set the global settings that we want to set across the network. How do we do that with Azure Active Directory if we don't have any GPOs? Well, with Azure Active Directory, you need another tool called Intune. It's also being called Microsoft Endpoint now. So you need to have this endpoint tool to really be able to put that together. Kind of one of those catches that comes up with this. Even some of the most modern technologies that are coming out. One of the ones that I laugh at recently is Microsoft has they've released the Windows Virtual Desktop, or now called Azure Virtual Desktop, up in Azure, which is the ability to spin up like workstations and secure them and do all sorts of really neat things up in the Azure cloud. That works really cool. It's a great feature. It's a great way to secure data. It still requires a local Active Directory. Something that's designed from the ground up to be purely inside of a cloud still requires Active Directory. It still requires it for all the settings. So even something as modern as that, something that is just it's still coming out and still really being deployed, still requires some of those more legacy technologies. And this is really where Azure Active Directory is not 100% replacement for Active Directory. There's still a lot of things that require legacy connection points, legacy applications, authentication tools, file services still aren't quite the same. So if you have the needs to have a lot of those older technologies or those legacy formats, you're still probably going to have an Azure Active, or you're still probably going to have a local Active Directory and then tied back up. If you are in a state where you can go purely into SharePoint, purely into the 365 productivity suite, and you don't need those servers anymore, Azure Active Directory has you covered. There is no reason to use all these other tools. So how do we put this all together now, right? So we've gone through all the features, we've gone through all the functions. What do we actually need to do to make this happen? So the thing I'm going to recommend is use the Microsoft 365 licenses. So we kind of alluded to this in the beginning, the Microsoft 365 versus the old O365 licenses. Microsoft 365 automatically includes that Azure AD P1 or P2 license, depending on what level you're buying. And it gives you a ton more than just that. It gives you that Intune license that you need to be able to manage those computers. It gives you the enhanced security. It gives you a lot of the functions that are, tie all of this together and allow you to be serverless out in that environment and still have the same management, the same security, the same controls that you normally would have. It also gives the ability to do things like autopilot. Autopilot is kind of a cool technology where out of the box, you can take a computer and you can register it into the system. Now I can ship a computer straight to a user that's on the other side of the country. We know we're all working remote now anyways. So when we do have that remote user, we can send that computer straight to them. We don't have to prep that computer. We don't have to do some of that kind of stuff. Right out of the box, it starts talking to the Microsoft systems, starts configuring itself, asks for a bunch of data, that you enter in your username, before you know it comes up with a prompt, you enter in your username and password, just like what you did in the demo, and you're logged right into your system. It's actually a really powerful tool set, and we're starting to see a lot more usage of it as we move forward. It does require a lot of setup in the front, but it is kind of a something that does help in the long roll of things.
Hey, Gerald, the only other thing I mentioned is that we're hearing from folks that not just if people are working remotely and maybe they might eventually come back to the office, but we're hearing folks talk about how they're expanding their geography from which they might choose to hire someone in the future, where they may be 100% remote always. And this
Yep.
is one of the challenges that they'll have is the traditional way of doing this. It's a little bit harder, or a lot harder, but using if that's a plan that your organization has, putting some of these pieces in place will make that much easier, a better experience for your new employee that might be in a remote, 100% remote environment.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great way of looking at that, right? Those are those remote, salespeople or operations people that are out in the field all the time. This does, this solves a lot of those kinds of things. Even their authentication, their passwords, everything are all tied up into the cloud. They never have to use that VPN anymore, right? So this is one of the other things that goes away. We don't need those VPNs as much. We don't need maybe even at all. Maybe there's only select people that need VPNs. The more you can cut some of that kind of stuff out, the more you can secure things. The funny part about VPNs, we always used to think that VPNs was the ultimate security tool. Hey, we can start extending our network while keeping it secure. But a lot of the recent hacks have actually happened because of VPNs. The latest pipeline break was actually because of some user accounts that weren't cleaned up off of the VPN system and were exploited. So knowing that those VPNs are still also a source of risk for the organizations, the more that we can get rid of those, the better off we are. And then this even asks the question, do we need servers anymore, right? If we can move all of our tools up into the Microsoft Productivity Suite, I don't need servers. This maybe puts me into a good spot of being able to get rid of everything else. So things to take note of. You need a license. Honestly, don't try to mess with everything. Just buy a license. I'm going to tell you it's the simplest and best method to go forward. Use MFA and conditional access. Really start locking down those environments. Start providing the controls. Start requiring MFA when you need it. Start looking at your organization and determining the areas of risk and figuring out when we need to do those kinds of things. And then even customizing the brand and logging. Make sure that those logins are branded. Start getting the logos and the interfaces inside that system, and getting that kind of stuff kind of taken care of. So with that said, hey, what are your next steps ultimately out of this? Make sure you join us for our next session. We've got some cool topics coming up. I think we're going to be building on this and kind of taking security to the next level inside your organization and around productivity documents. We'll be, so we're going to be talking about the document classification, some of that kind of stuff. And if you have missed our previous sessions before this one, make sure you check out the mytech.com Power User Group site, which will have the recordings that you can go and learn all of our missed topics.
And Stephanie posted the link to the previous topics in the chat earlier as well. So you can just click on that. That takes you, I think, right to the YouTube channel that's got a playlist that's just for the power user stuff as well. So
cool. Thanks for that, Stephanie. With that said, I'd like to open it up for questions. If anybody has questions, be more than happy to discuss or answer those right now.
So Gerald, there's not a question yet, so let me buy some time for folks to post a question in the chat or raise your hand. But I don't think we addressed something that I found surprising as we embark down this path, is how there's not really a migration path from on-premise Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. Can you speak to that a little bit for those that might be considering going serverless and just leveraging Azure Active Directory?
Yeah, so if you've got an extensive local Active Directory environment, or all your computers are joined to that Active Directory environment, there is kind of a sequence that you have to follow, and not all of that is as simple as it could sound. So if you already have that environment, the first step is connecting that up to the Azure Active Directory, getting that synchronization started. Then there's some series of kind of prepping the hardware, getting the machines ready. But where the biggest change happens is when we want to get rid of that existing Active Directory and we're ready to finish this conversion, is we have to go around to all the computers and we have to basically convert them from having that local Active Directory interface and authentication type to having the Azure Active Directory, which is basically resetting accounts and rebuilding stuff, which is kind of laborsome and tedious, honestly. But doing all of that really does secure the environment and finishes this up. And this is the, it's unfortunately it's not a string that's tying the two. It's a big honking rope, and you kind of have to slowly cut away at it. So the more devices you have on-prem, the harder it is to do those kind of conversions. But we have done them; they are doable. It's just a lot of work.
Yeah, and it is again, there is some disruption to the end user in particular, because when you're saying that it resets profiles. So there's things that we've learned that can help make it so the experience from one to the other is similar, but again, it's almost like getting a new computer as far as when that profile gets reset, and some of the things like the shortcuts might have to get redone. There's just some of those things you have to be aware of. So it's you'd like to think that all this stuff just happens in the back end, but when you actually, if you go down that path to make the conversion, factoring that piece into the equation is a good little nugget to consider.
I will say it's a good time to buy a new computer.
Yeah, well, that's good. Yeah.
If you're going to go through the pain, may as well go through the pain at the same time. So yeah.
I'm not seeing other questions here, Gerald. Could one of the other things that you touched on, but I think is an important note about the licensing, is that Microsoft, when you have some of these licenses that include the ability to do multi-factor authentication, there's getting the license that actually includes the conditional access is kind of a major deal relative to how it might impact your organization if you're trying to roll that out. So again, you touched on it, but can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think as far as an impact to your team, impact to your organization, it is a big deal. So can you touch on that?
Yeah, so you really do want conditional access. It really makes the life easier for everybody underneath those using conditional access for that. That does require an Azure AD P1 or P2 license for every user in your environment. And when I say user, those are going to be logins that are going to be happening to the 365 or Azure world. So every one of those users that's going to be authenticating, if you have that copier scanner device that's signing in, that needs a license also. So you really do need to have those licenses for every one of those users. Now you can do a mix and match of what you're using. So maybe you're going to buy M365 licenses for a lot of your users, but that scanner copier, you're just going to buy an email only license. You can buy that email only license for that scanner copier and then an Azure AD P1 license on it, and you'll get the same features as what you would need for everybody else inside the organization. So you can kind of play some, adding some licenses and modifying some things here and there to make that better. But yeah, you can ultimately, you do want to get that license to set that up and turn those features on for everybody inside the organization.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why, Gerald, I've found too, is that in the initial deployment, if you don't have some of that capabilities, and again, you know this better than I do, so I just want to make sure that I don't step on somebody's toes or say the wrong thing here, but is that if you have several people and you're trying to work through different folks and say turn on MFA and say, all right, here's how you use it, let's make sure everybody can connect. If you don't have that extra conditional access, you turn it all on for everybody or all off for everybody. And so if you need to turn it off for one person or another, you can't do it. Isn't there something there that is a challenge for which could be really painful when you're trying to roll that out and make sure everyone can access?
Exactly. And I think this is a scenario that we've seen where sometimes the younger staff in the company don't have a problem. Like they already use MFA for their Facebook and their Gmail and everything else under the sun. So this is just yet another account that has MFA. But some of the older staff aren't used to those kinds of functions yet. They aren't used to having to have, or the less technical even, don't have those MFA functions. And so they require a little more handholding. And so you can kind of break things up a little bit easier. You can extend out those conversions and make those conversions happen in a easier process for everybody to accept. So you can actually start locking things down for some people, start the ones that you can easily adopt into the system, get them on, start enabling those actions, and then your laggers, your technology laggers in that scenario, we can actually spend more time with them and enable when they're ready for it.
Yeah, that's I know another Do you have to do that? No, but you know, when you're considering how the rollout happens and the impact to folks, you can kind of pick a group by group or person by person if you have that capability, which we found very beneficial overall in working with our clients. So.
Yep. Especially if the organization's larger, where you know, no matter how much you try to communicate and send out notices, hey, this is the day we're going to do this, and then you flip the switch, and then everybody complains for the next 10 days, and then you know, 14 days after that, you've got a whole bunch of users that can't sign in because they never completed any of it. At least with the system, we can make sure that we can kind of do it in stages. We can say, okay, this department's going to go, make sure everybody's good, make sure that they can authenticate, pull reports that tell us whether or not they're authenticating the way we expect them to, and then move on to the next department.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any questions or hands raised. I think I don't think I have anything else. I don't know if you have any nuggets, other nuggets of advice that you held back, Gerald, or anything like that. Sometimes I know we do that, but otherwise, I know that I learned a lot through this. So let's maybe pause for awkward pause briefly for any final questions before we adjourn. I think that was awkward enough. So thanks everybody for joining. Gerald, thank you. And for finding, I mean, it's hard to figure out how to demonstrate Azure Active Directory, right, without digging in, but trying to find some ways that are applicable to how, you know, it might impact folks in your team. So Gerald, great job on that. And thanks everyone who attended in person, and for those who are watching again remote. Again, great. Thanks for joining. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay tuned for future events. We're going to publish all events for Q3 and going into Q4 starting next week. So stay tuned and you'll get some follow-up emails for that too. Thanks everybody. Make it a great day and have a great weekend.